Good morning and welcome to the 36th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. Apologies have been received from Alison Harris and Willie Coffey. John Mason is attending as Willie's substitute and Graham Simpson is attending on Alison's behalf. I would also like to welcome back Gordon MacDonald, who returns to us this meeting. The first item on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 4 and 5 in private. Are we agreed? Thank you. We then move to item 2 on the agenda, which is our inquiry into the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's businesses, workers and the economy. The committee published its interim report on this inquiry on 13th November. And we're now focusing on the different geographies and areas in Scotland. Today we look at urban areas, and we have up to 1 hour for this evidence session. I welcome our witnesses who join us remotely. They are Jane Morrison-Ross, who is the Chief Executive of Scotland IS, Pamela Stevenson, Service Manager, Economic Development, Business and Employability, Fife Council and Vice Chair of Scottish Local Authorities Economic Development, and also David Waite, who is a Research Fellow in the Policy Scotland and Urban Studies School of Social, from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow. Now, just for the benefit of our witnesses, I should say that some of our committee members are here in the room with me, and some are online, like yourselves, so joining us remotely. Committee members will each ask questions. It would be helpful if you as witnesses could simply either indicate by raising your hand or typing R in the chat box on your screen. We won't have time, obviously, to hear from all of you about everything this morning that you may want to say, but you're welcome to write in after today's session with further comments for the committee that we can then look at. So we'll now turn to questions from committee members, and perhaps I could start with a question about the impact that our panel witnesses think COVID has had on Scotland's cities, town centres, office areas, for example, where people would normally work but have been working from home. Do you have comments to make on that, and whether actions have been taken that are sufficient to deal with the issues that have arisen out of COVID-19 for Scotland's town centres and city centres? Who would like to give us their comments on that? We'll start with David Waite. Thank you.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I think cities, fundamentally, city economies rely on social interaction. The very nature of cities is based on the idea that physical proximity provides certain benefits in economic production and consumption. When that world is turned upside down, as we're living through now, then that's very problematic for cities. I think the questions many urban economists like myself are posing is, we're certainly confronted with a number of short-term dislocations, and we can see that in terms of people not returning to offices or only very slightly, and even being actively discouraged from doing so at the moment. And that obviously has implications for businesses who rely on passing trade from those sorts of activities. So these are profound effects in the short term for how city centres work. In the long term, we're then confronted with a problem of, will these behaviours set in for a longer period of time? If in a bad case scenario, it's a long time before we get out of the realm of social distancing, etc. Simply put, the decisions firms and workers make might be to simply avoid contact over a longer period of time, and that would have long-term scarring effects on urban economies. So those are the big issues that I think economists are concerned with for places, for big cities like Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Glasgow, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think committee member Graham Simpson would also like to come in on these points and perhaps some further ones before our other witnesses come in to perhaps add their comment. Just for the benefit of committee members in the room, if you press your speak button and then once you've finished speaking, ignore me on that. I'm being indicated by the sound desk. I think the sound desk will operate mics here in the room. So disregard that, please. Simply for our witnesses remotely, perhaps if you give just a few seconds once you're asked to speak before you start, and that then gives us the opportunity to connect you up here. So I'll hand to Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I'm just wondering what the witnesses think about the sort of medium to long-term effects on town and city centres with regard to what's happening now. I mean, I used to work in Glasgow city centre. I worked for a newspaper, and now my former colleagues are pretty much all working from home. So that office, which will be an expensive office, is now pretty much deserted. And so once we're through this pandemic, I think companies have decisions to make, and I would think, and you may agree or disagree, that some of them will decide, well, this home working business can carry on to some degree, and B, actually we don't need to spend a lot of money on expensive city centre offices. We could work from anywhere almost in the world. So do you think there'll be a medium to long-term effect on offices in town and city centres? And if you do think that, what do you think the solution is?
I think Pamela Stevenson wanted to come in. I also see that Jane Morrison-Ross was nodding her head during the question, so perhaps hear from Pamela first and then Jane.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah,
I think.
What's happening?
Oh, sorry. Carry on. We've got you back.
Right. You've got me. So I think just to continue from what David said, we know the sort of impact we're currently in, and that short-term measure of people wanting to work from home, perhaps stay away from that realm of crowded spaces. What is some of the solutions from an economic perspective, and some of the areas we're looking at in terms of reform and recovery is, well, what is the new role of our town centres beyond retail and hospitality? How do we diversify uses of existing buildings? How do we use more buildings for more of an enterprise, touchdown, flexible space, developing new housing in town centres? How do we start to work with our national agencies around place-based modelling or remodelling of our town centres? How do we look at a reduction in streets and expand the green space and town squares? So there's lots of information in that, and I do think that there's opportunities ahead. So although we feel that we're in a very bad position just now with our town centres and particularly our commercial aspects to the cities, I think that we need to work collectively together across Scotland to look at what the opportunities are for revitalising and remodelling our cities and our town centres.
Thank you, and we'll come to Jane then.
Good morning. I would agree with what's been said so far. We are certainly seeing a pattern across our industry of companies reevaluating the way they work and looking to move to a more flexible working model, which I think has benefits. The knock-on effect of that is that many of them are considering downsizing the office premises they have in city centres. The overwhelming feeling is that they still want a physical hub, but I think we will see a change in the size of the hub that companies are keeping as they move to that more flexible approach.
Yes, Convener, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure we got any kind of vision there of what the witnesses think is going to happen. I mean, clearly, if companies decide to downsize, that's potentially got a major effect, certainly on city centres and some town centres. You'll have less people working in these places. That affects the economy, as it is already. So in the medium to long term, you know, the buildings have to be used for something. How are we going to get people into town and city centres and keep the economy going in those areas?
David, wait.
Good morning. And Mr. Simpson's point's very important, and I think the prior remark was very germane as well. I think it's difficult to be predictive at the moment. I think a lot of companies are trying to assess what extent they're going to have to change their behaviours. You know, ONS data shows before the crisis, home working was a very niche thing, very small in terms of the UK's workforce was doing this. It's been quite remarkable and perhaps a sign of resilience in the UK and Scottish economy that home working has shifted to the extent that it has through the preceding months. I think a lot of firms, from what I can tell, are giving very mixed messages about what will happen to their commercial property holdings, etc., and what they will do with that. In the medium term, in the short term, sort of pre-vaccine, you know, the idea of blended working is coming in a lot, whereby you might be in the office 2 days a week, working from home 3 days a week. Obviously, that's something, but it's still not the vibrant city centres that we were used to prior to COVID. I think I think we almost have to sort of hold fire to a degree and try and make the city centres as livable as we can. Make, as was remarked prior, make green spaces prominent, make city centres attractive destinations for people to interact in. I think understanding how firms are going to interact is very challenging. We also have to remember that we're almost in a sort of getting by economy at the moment, where people are doing things out of necessity to keep things going. That doesn't mean that firms necessarily see this as optimal or as the best way of running their organizations. So, for example, we know that there are benefits from face-to-face interactions for things such as innovation. For a lot of firms, that's still going to be important. That's still going to reflect the value of being close together, with workers being close together. And so I think a lot of firms will still treasure that and see that as important in the long term. Thank you.
I'll move on to Gordon MacDonald, who I think wants to follow up 1 or 2 points there and also move on to other matters.
Thanks very much, Convener. Before I ask my own questions, I was wanting to just continue this discussion about city and town centres and the impact of COVID. The KPMG Retail Think Tank report that was published in the last month said the direction of change that UK retail sector is heading in has not diverged due to COVID, but has accelerated the need for fundamental structural changes and innovation in the ways retailers operate and reach their customers. And I was just wondering what the panel's view on that was. And secondly, as a result of companies re-evaluating whether they require the same level of footprint in the city centre, what opportunities does that give other independent retailers and the possibility of people who over decades have been driven out of the city centre to be able to repopulate the city centre if office space is converted back into homes? Pamela, you touched on this earlier. Do you want to open up? Anybody?
Do we have Pamela? Are you hearing us here in the room?
No. Yes, I am. I've just obviously noticed David's up with his hand up.
Right. I think sometimes committee members will simply, indicate if one of you has raised a point and come directly to you. No need to go through me, as it were. And I think Gordon had mentioned that you'd covered one of these points previously. I don't know if you want, David can come back and then perhaps come across to you then. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Obviously, the shocks to retail have been pronounced, particularly city centre retailers. We know from the chief economist of the Bank of England that online channels for retail have increased significantly through the COVID shock, and the expectation is that will be sustained to some degree. So the question is, what kind of retail? What kind of retail will we have in city centres? It may not look as it did before, and that's a big challenge again. I'm afraid I can't be too predictive on what it will be like. A lot really depends on the course of this pandemic and how it affects people's willingness to travel to city centres. And obviously retail has the retail volumes in city centres are fundamentally shaped by, the proximity of office workers, the proximity of university students, etc., who all provide essential demand for those shops. So the ability to get those people back into city centres will be fundamental. So it might be a question of not whether there is retail, but what kind of retail might we see in city and town centres.
And I think Jane wanted to come in.
Thank you. I think just to add, I completely concur with what's being said. I think in terms of retail, we are seeing a huge boost in online trading and e-commerce. It grew 168% in the UK in the initial stages of lockdown. There is still a huge amount of opportunity to grow that, and our market share as part of the UK is still woefully behind where it should be. And given the percentage of micro businesses and SMEs in Scotland in multiple sectors, I absolutely welcome the latest steps that are being put in place to look at how we can digitally enable those small producers, artisan producers and micro businesses in multiple sectors, because I think that's going to be key to recovery and economic growth, not as an alternative to physical premises, but as an additional channel for those smaller businesses to make use of.
And I think, Pamela, now, if you were able to give your comments.
Yes, thank you. Again, I'm just following up with David and Jane. One of the experiences that we've had since COVID is in the fantastic artisan small businesses coming together in almost to set up digital platforms to trade online. And we've obviously, through our local economic agencies and business gateway networks, we've been supporting businesses throughout to adapt and repurpose their retail and their hospitality capabilities so that they can make sure that they continue to trade. Now, what we're actually starting to see is they're working through these platforms of such as Shop Happy and others, where they're working together, they're looking at supply chain and procurement together, looking at distribution together. So I don't think we have answers on what retail will look like moving forward. I know that the physical presence may not necessarily be there, but there could be some sort of supply and demand, local distribution capabilities that can lead into hubs across Scotland and certainly much link into some of our trade development work. But yeah, we've seen some fantastic examples of retail converting and adapting to digital capabilities to trade online.
Thanks very much for those contributions. We've already touched upon the fact that there has been a quicker movement to digital, and you mentioned, Jane, the 168% increase in sales. How's that reflected in employment in the sector? Has there been more jobs created, or has it sustained more jobs, or what's the situation?
Overall, we are not seeing a drop in demand for skills in the sector, and the majority of companies in the industry, I think around 70% at last survey, were still optimistic and we're still predicting additional headcount growth. We are seeing additional demand across other traditional industry sectors as they look for additional digital skills to help them make that pivot that Pamela talked about. So it's covering everything from your first-class computer science graduates for some of the more traditional technology industry, but it goes right through to digital skills for web, e-commerce skills, CRM skills, the basic fundamental building blocks that funds like Digital Boost are trying to support just now in non-technology industries. So yes, we're still seeing a shortage of skills and we're still seeing a demand for skills.
And it's great to see so many Indigenous companies that are moving onto the digital platform. And we've obviously got the skill set in Scotland to attract companies. So how well are we doing in attracting companies to come here? I was thinking about the recent announcement of the Californian company User Testing in Edinburgh that's going to create, I think, or employ 70 people in Edinburgh. Is that just a one-off, or is there more and more companies coming over to Scotland to take the benefit of our highly skilled employees?
We're still seeing a significant number coming. That's a great example. Elcom was another recent one. Some of the emerging technology sectors like geospatial data and the space sector are also increasing and encouraging companies to come here. Spire Global in Glasgow is a great example. You know, they're building more satellites in Glasgow than in any other European city. So we are definitely still seeing that demand, partly because of the access to the skills from our university and college sectors, partly because SDI and Scottish Enterprise have invested in creating an infrastructure that's supportive and welcoming to those companies. And through some of the recent events I've been involved with SDI, we are still seeing companies very, very interested in making the move over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you. Any of the other panel get any comments? No.
Right. I think we are under a bit of time pressure here, a lot of committee members wanting to get in. So we'll move on to Richard Lyle, who joins us remotely. Richard.
Yes, thank you, Convener. And slightly touched on, the Advisory Group and Economic Recovery AGA report recommended a pivot to a more regional model of economic development to drive place-based recovery and solutions. Is this pivot happening, and what actions would you like to see? I think Jane Morris-Rose would be first. Morrison-Rose, sorry.
No, it's all right. I think yes, there is, and the launch of organisations like the South of Scotland Enterprise are supportive to that, the work that's going on in Highlands and Islands. I think there is a need to ensure that we have the national infrastructure in place to support that pivot, while having the regional depth of knowledge across each industry sector and geography that can really enable the growth of businesses in those areas. So I think it has to be the combination of the two, but certainly from where we're standing, we are seeing that depth of expertise come to the fore across multiple regions.
Can I ask further, and other members, to Jane Morris-Rose again, but other members could come in. More generally, what are your views on what should be done to promote economic recovery from the impact of the pandemic? What should be done to support, again, the digital sector role, which has been touched on slightly, in Scotland's economic recovery?
Thank you. I think there's two answers to that. One, the digital sector itself has been remarkably resilient. We are seeing overwhelmingly 70% of members predicting growth, optimistic about the future, generally more concerned about clarity on exit strategy and understanding the impact of Brexit, actually, than COVID-specific restrictions at the moment, partly because the industry has had additional opportunities to provide services, support and products to other industry sectors. And I think it's that second part that's absolutely key. Every business now is a digital business, in part due to the need to recover and the need to grow, and the fact that the situation over the last 8 months or so has massively accelerated the uptake of digital technology practically in every sector. And I think initiatives like Digital Boost and potentially a new fund that's being looked at now, as I understand, with the UK government, to provide additional support to SMEs across those sectors to make that step change to use enabling technology is absolutely critical. Digital Boost is fantastic. It provides support for companies to access the technology. I think part of the layer that's been identified as missing that we would agree with is the expertise to understand what to do with that technology and how it applies to your business, whether you are a small artisan cheese producer or a manufacturing company in the borders. It's that expertise, and that I think is being addressed now.
We'll bring in
David.
Sorry, we'll bring in briefly David and Pamela then.
Thank you, Mr. Convener. Just a regional pivot point, if that's still relevant. I think that's a really interesting point, and obviously that was made in the Higgins report quite strongly. I think we're seeing it and we're not in some ways. I think obviously following the Skills and Enterprise Review in 2017, regional economic partnerships were set up, which essentially tried to provide a forum whereby national agencies and local authorities could discuss local and regional strategic priorities. So that's promising step, and hopefully they'll be effective in that role. I think on the other hand, though, local authorities still don't have a huge armoury of levers by which to shape local economic change. So that's still an issue that could be thought through and discussed. On the digital economy point raised latterly, I think that's really important. I don't have the depth of sectoral knowledge as per the last speaker, but I guess there's a couple of issues. One, on the production side, I think the Logan Review was rightly lauded for setting out quite a good pathway for thinking about the digital sector. And also we have to think about who's using digital. It's been described by some academics as the new sanitation of our time for urban areas. So who has stable Wi-Fi, who has access to ICT is going to be increasingly important for a number of workers now. Thanks.
Pamela, what's your council doing to promote this?
So yeah, very good point, and I agree with the previous speakers. It's a difficult time, and if I'm very truthful, we're still dealing with rapid response to COVID to support businesses, and it's a very distressing time for businesses. So it's a very important time that we focus on that, but while still looking at that short to medium term of our reform and recovery programmes. Some of the main areas that we are, and it's important linked to that national approach and how we dovetail, is that we have to, it's fundamental we work with our national agencies, and we've got fantastic examples of working closely with Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, SDI, to make sure that we can start to look at skills development. How are we supporting our businesses retrain, reskill, adapt, look at multi-skilling during the current conditions to make sure we can stop redundancy and unemployment? How do we work with some of the young people who are starting to leave school or leave college, and ensure that as part of the DWP and some of our youth employment opportunities, we're able to help them get into some of the businesses, to support the businesses and to support the individuals. How do we start to look at what jobs are out there, and how are we helping businesses understand, sustain using low carbon products and services to grow, and support businesses look at some investment in some of their low carbon infrastructure. We're starting to see some evidence of that, looking at longer term efficiencies. Obviously, Jane's made reference to the digital connectivity. As I said, there's been some fantastic case examples across Scotland, not just from advanced manufacturing, but from fintech, looking at many Indigenous little entrepreneurs who have readapted and repurposed their business, and lots of little startups in the current conditions who we just simply didn't expect to see so many startups during this time. It's been fantastic to see. One of the things in Fife we've been doing, and we have been looking at this as part of our sort of well-renowned Culture of Enterprise programme, is how we've started to readapt this year with our programmes, our enterprise and education programmes into all of the 5 schools. We've now managed to convert all them into digital delivery approaches, and that's starting to show some proof, working with Code Clan, working with our colleges, to try and ensure that we're able to virtually engage with schools to help them understand the economy and enterprise and education. Some of the other activities is obviously around data-driven innovation, working with universities to help businesses. And again, I'm not going to go into that too much. Jane's made reference to it. The development and ongoing support from Scottish Government into our gateway networks for Digital Boost has been absolutely second to none, and we need more of that. The demand is great. Engaging with businesses, obviously through COVID, we're continually to look at opportunities to understand the barometer of where businesses are. And again, we're trying to look at that workforce upskilling, looking at remodelling, looking at adaptation, new trade opportunities, new market opportunities. How do they take their existing products and put it into new markets? And sometimes through COVID, we've found some fantastic examples of taking their existing product and put it into a whole new sector, and particularly with the support of the NHS and helping the COVID response. So some of the other areas obviously is around refocusing on procurement. We've made reference to town centres, looking at better planning and regulation around how we make sure placemaking has more input and planning surettes. And one of the big areas from an economic perspective, working closely with SE and SDI, is investment-led growth. How do we make sure we've got fit for purpose employment land and investment in infrastructure to support inward investment, but also support the adaptation and growth of our Indigenous businesses. So I'll not go on too much. There is actually, it's distressing times, but there is some fantastic opportunities ahead and some opportunities to be a bit more creative thinking of how we deliver our local economic development.
I think you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
Convener.
I think if you do want to go into detail, it would be helpful if that's done in writing following the meeting due to our limited time. So thank you for that. We'll move on to Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. And this is a question for every member of the panel. Perhaps we'll start with David this time. We've talked about the recovery, but I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on the green recovery generally, and specifically how will the Scottish National Investment Bank and indeed City deals feature in that recovery? David, if we could start with you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. The green recovery, there's obviously a lot of discussion about this from local authorities right up to sort of multilateral organisations, sort of making the argument that our recovery from this crisis simply can't serve the needs for the next crisis. So it's quite a potent argument, really. I guess there are a range of different forms that a green recovery may take. You know, do we need to look at a green industrial policy that will really focus on the transitions process? How do we prioritise infrastructure investments that take green objectives in a more central role? And are we really following through with the promises, the win-win promises of the retrofit agenda, where it's argued that this will both help with jobs in the short term, but also lead to sort of energy efficiencies in the long term? I think if you look across the piece in terms of city deals, obviously the evolution of those is worked across since 2014, so they're quite different in nature and in terms of the projects that compromise them. But I think maybe in some of the latter details, you can see some of these objectives coming through more as well. I guess there's also the important policy questions of how we take the sustainable development goals. I think we're seeing that more and more as a framing for thinking about the green recovery. We're seeing it, for instance, in Bristol's recovery plan. And I think there's murmurings even in Glasgow following the Climate Emergency Working Group last year to use the sustainable development goals as sort of guiding lights for the green recovery. I think in terms of Scottish National Investment Bank, obviously it's early days, but I think one of their core missions is essentially around a green recovery. So a lot is pointing in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go to Jane next, please.
Thank you. Again, I agree with David's comments there. I think we are seeing an increased focus across industry and how digital technologies and associated supply chain can pivot to start to tackle some of the climate challenges. I think the focus running up to COP26 has helped that enormously, and the recent Road to COP26 event that was run across all of the innovation centres and with Scottish Enterprise brought a huge amount of focus to that. Skills Development Scotland recently commissioned a study into the skills needed for climate technologies and for companies to start to access those skills at a practical level to tackle some of these issues. I think what's needed next, and what we've been looking at and talking to the Scottish Government's new Green Deal team about, is practical information and advice for companies to start to make a difference at a tactical level as well as a strategic level. But I think there is a significant amount of expertise in Scotland, and as Pamela mentioned earlier, a significant amount of innovation that can be pivoted and refocused to start to address some of the climate challenges. And the collaboration element of that is particularly important, I think, whether that's between organisations like Census and Data Lab, and Digital Health and the 5G Centre, and with broader academic and industry partners. I think that for me is key.
Thank you, Jane. And finally, we'll move to Pamela.
Thank you. I don't have too much more to add from David and Jane. I think they've covered it. I mean, the main focus is around, how do we help businesses have access to the expertise to be more innovative around their efficiencies and sustainability and low carbon capabilities? How do we do these collaborations, and what are some of the decarbonising transport, energy and industry projects that we can do within our local areas and regions that help these supply chain opportunities?
Pamela, do you have any thoughts in terms of what Fife is doing? You mentioned how do we we do it. Do you have any examples from Fife that you can highlight to the committee?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, I'll not reference names as such, but there is companies we're working with who are very fleet-maintained companies, and we're working in partnership with ST and Zero Waste Scotland, etc., to go out and help these businesses look at efficiencies around their low carbon, looking at opportunities where they can put in a clean growth vision for their fleet and transport, and also other logistical capabilities, and helping them, working with the likes of the Green Team within the Scottish National Investment Bank. How do we help fund some of these infrastructure projects that helps this business, but also helps them with their supply chain if they're big employers? You know, how do we also work with some of our industry action and investment plans with some of our big field businesses and Fives, such as both Ports, Shell, Babcock and Amazon? And then, of course, we're working with the councils itself on our own infrastructure projects around the Leavenmouth rail link, the delivery of the Fife Sea Cap, looking at how a council in its own right look at EV charging points in an investment programme. And I think that's similar across lots of the local authorities in Scotland.
Thank you, Pamela. Very useful, and thank you, convener.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, convener. I think we're all aware that there are a number of support schemes such as furlough which are protecting employment. But are we protecting employment, or are we simply delaying unemployment by pushing it into the future? I think I saw a figure of something like 240,000 people in Scotland are on furlough. So are we just delaying what's going to come inevitably as mass unemployment, or is this actually an effective way to carry us through this period?
If I could answer initially, I can only speak for the industry sector that I have depth of knowledge of. We found only a very small proportion of companies took advantage of the furlough scheme in the technology industry early on in the lockdown period, and with most of them, and it was under 20%, it was precautionary as they assessed the impact on their supply chains of COVID-19 as a whole. We have not seen a significant number of redundancies or layoffs as an impact of COVID or furlough. It's been much more used as a precautionary tool, but again, that is in the technology industry, and I understand that in other industry sectors, it's been a much more important tool to keep businesses afloat. Our cross-sector advisory group, which is made up of Scotland's key sectors, I think in some areas, retail and hospitality would be the two, obviously, that would come to mind. Furlough was instrumental in keeping some businesses going. There has been significant impact and redundancies, but I think furlough has played an important part in helping companies through that otherwise would not have survived, but have.
Does anyone else have a view on that? Are we facing a cliff edge?
David, I think, wanted to come in.
Thank you, convener. The issue of sort of zombie jobs is really important. I think the general consensus that furlough has been vital for a number of firms to sort of hold on to headcounts. I think, a few months ago there was talk about various cliff edges and about significant unemployment coming into the winter, and I think the view is that it's been saved from that to a large degree. Obviously, we've got more challenges ahead, but it has given firms a significant help, I think. I think one of the challenges in the labour market, which is related to furlough, though, is for those who are losing their jobs, vacancies is really limited. Vacancies are really sluggish at the moment. So if you lose your job, the ability to go into a new job is a real challenge at the moment. So a lot of commentators are making the point that policy efforts have to be put into things like retraining processes and helping people move from into new occupations. So the hiring, who's actually putting vacancies around, I think is crucial to consider now.
Just specifically on the young people in the labour market, has there been a particular impact on them?
There is evidence in terms of, for instance, universal credit claimants in Glasgow, for example. They're one of the higher groups and still rapidly moving into universal credit. And so there are significant concerns for young people, I think, across Scotland. This is also accentuated by the fact that shocks in a young career can have long-term scarring effects. So your incidence of future unemployment periods and scarring on your actual wages in the future is shown to be impacted by periods of unemployment when you're young. So the concern for young people, I think, is really right and valid.
I'm not getting a feeling from the panel as to a view on what happens when furlough finishes, which was one of the key aspects that I wanted to explore. Everybody seems to be saying that furlough is good and that it's protected jobs certainly in the short term, but what happens when it finishes? What are we facing then?
Pamela Stevenson.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question, and I'm apologetic, but we don't have that crystal ball. And I think, as David and Jane said, the furlough has been extremely fundamental till now. We did make some assumptions that perhaps there was going to be this cliff edge in October. That hasn't happened. We haven't seen the figures coming in. We're working closely from local authorities' perspective with Scottish Enterprise and Skills Development Scotland through the PACE programme, Scottish Government's PACE redundancy programme, to ensure that where we are aware and have transparency of businesses who are looking to make redundancies, we're trying to find opportunities to add value by looking at redeployment. What do we do with businesses just now that have people in furlough? Well, we're out there working collectively to try and ensure these businesses are readapting, repurposing, looking at opportunities to multi-skill, looking at leaner processes, because we need to ensure that when we get to the end of March, we have opportunities to ensure these individual employees get back into the business rather than be then delay the inevitable. So we are trying to strive to ensure that from an economic perspective, we are getting out there working with businesses to identify the needs they currently need now to adapt business models.
Right, thank you. I think we're going to have to move on because we've another 3 committee members wanting to come in with a few questions. So first of all, Rhoda Grant, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. The advisory group recommended the creation of a Scottish Jobs Guarantee Scheme, which the government have now implemented and called the Scottish Young Persons Guarantee. The advisory group said the scheme should offer secure employment for a period of at least 2 years, 16 to 25-year-olds, paid at the living wage with access to training, apprenticeships and the possibility of progression. Should be delivered locally with brokerage opportunities between employers and job seekers, and it should be set within a coherent national framework. Now, the Scottish Government have set up their Young Persons Guarantee. Can I ask the witnesses what are their views on the government scheme and what steps they can take to ensure it's effective and to make sure that there are no barriers to its success? Does someone want to come in?
Pamela Stevenson. Sorry. Pamela and then Jane.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll keep this short. I can only talk for Fife at the minute. And again, Fife has a very good relationship with our national agencies. We are working and striving in Fife to ensure that our employability proposition is a partnership collaborative approach that starts from grassroots and gives a pipeline of progressive capabilities for these individuals. And we will be working closely with all of the partnerships and businesses to ensure that this is not just a short-term measure, that this does have a career journey pathway for the individuals.
Okay, I think Jane wanted to come in.
Thank you. Just briefly to add to that we are working with both Skills Development Scotland and DWP and the Youth Guarantee team to get the message out to industry, both to our industry and to the cross-sector groups that we work with, that this scheme is available and it's there. And it's a very effective way of bringing young, energetic people into your business and helping them to grow into the roles. So that it's an enormously useful tool. And I think that, coupled with the, I suppose, increased focus on various apprenticeships that businesses can source, is really, really important in helping in our industry to close that skills gap We on average have 13,000 vacancies per year, and we're only seeing that increase with the cross-sector demand for digital skills now. So I think as long as we get the messages out there to the right companies and the right parts of industry, that this has real significant potential.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
David, did you have anything to add?
Sorry, I have nothing to add to my previous comments, only to sort of reiterate the point about the importance of, provisions for the young persons in the labour market. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'll leave it there if we're short of time.
All right, thank you. And now come on to questions from John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. And it was in the area of kind of business support that comes from the public sector. We've got Scottish Enterprise, HIE, South of Scotland, SDS have all been mentioned already, and then SNIB's coming in as well. I mean, is the feeling of the panel, and maybe I can start with Ms Stevenson, that they have they been too focused on COVID or not focused enough? And then maybe also kind of going forward, because we do want to continue our long-term plans as well as reacting to COVID.
Very good point. We have actually been in conversations about this morning. To be truthful, we are still focusing on some of the requirements of immediate response to the COVID business support funding, and we have to do that because so many of the businesses that are affected need our support. So we are focusing on that. But at the same time, we're working on still looking at that recovery programme and how do we ensure that businesses become adaptable to engage moving forward and sustain. So there's lots of work going on to ensure that the business support is still happening versus the work we're doing. Some of the immediate team are working on COVID response, but it's very important that we're looking at advanced manufacturing, digital skills capabilities, access to finance, particularly though looking at the workforce upskilling capabilities and opportunities for supporting the unemployment process and the young persons process. So there's not one answer, sir. There's so much happening. It's very overwhelming in truth, but it's something that we have to be engaged in fully.
I mean, you said we quite a lot there, and I don't know if that means the council together with these other organisations. You've got a few hats on, I know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't expect you to be too critical of SC or anybody, but I mean, how do you feel they are lined up with what the council is thinking? I mean, it's early days for SNIB. How are they looking at it?
Well, we're working nationally through SLADE, our national economic teams, to work alongside Scottish Enterprise to try and make sure we can start to look at what that recovery looks like based on the Scottish Government objectives and the AGR and the Higgins reports. Locally, though, we're obviously the local authorities at economic level are heavily focused on COVID response, while still having to look at the proposition of what does it mean to be working with our national agencies at a regional level. So yeah, very positive, and we're trying to ensure that we can share best practice across Scotland to work with our national agencies.
I mean, thanks. Maybe I could move to Jane Morrison-Ross. I mean, do you feel you're getting a joined-up approach from the public sector and business support, or are there different agencies looking at things differently?
I think in general we have found there is a very joined-up approach, and we have very much welcomed the interactive approach. We found all of the public sector agencies involved in this have been very keen to come directly to industry to ask what's needed, both in terms of recovery, but also looking ahead post-COVID and not stopping the planning for that innovation. I think it's been helped by the STER report that Mark Logan produced, which has helped to move the focus a little bit post-COVID. But definitely, I think for us, the balance has been pretty much on point. And the direct connection and communication has been hugely welcomed.
And I suppose finally, Mr Waite, do you also see a joined-up approach from the public sector?
I'm not close to the policy coalface like colleagues, but I think one important point is how we might take a regional approach, going back almost to the first question, in the sense that we know areas of Scotland are going to be impacted very differently by this. So can we come up with almost regionally sensitive industrial policy or regionally sensitive industrial supports to help business spaces grow back. I think that's going to be a really important point, because how Aberdeen, Glasgow, Edinburgh deals with this and the responses might need to look quite different. So this is a good test for that regional pivot that the Higgins report was calling for. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And now Andy Whiteman, who is here with us in the room.
Thanks very much, Convener. Earlier on, David, you mentioned that local government have got limited powers to shape economic development. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, and then over to Pamela to ask whether, in fact, you feel that you've had the powers that you need to shape the economic response to COVID.
Thank you. Yes, important point. I think there have been welcome steps, I should say, in the sense that city deals do give a focus, for instance, on spending on localities, giving some direction to local spending priorities. So that's a welcome step, I think. I think one of the questions is to what extent revenue-raising powers might come in the gift of local authorities to a greater degree. So local authorities can make investments and take risks on those investments in terms of stimulating economic development. That's something where I think movement has been, there's been less progress on those areas. But for instance, there's obviously ongoing discussions in Edinburgh about tourism levy, prior to COVID at least. So I think there might be a case for at least for a discussion about where fiscal autonomies might lie within Scottish local authorities.
Thank you. Pamela?
To respond specifically to your question around the empowerment during COVID, I've been so encouraged over the last 7-8 months, in truth, to see how much the local authority economic developments have actually been able to respond and react very positively and timelessly to supporting businesses and the local authorities, the 32 local authorities coming together across Scotland to work very closely with Scottish Government, which, to be in truth, has never been as close as it is now. So I'm very encouraged with how well the local authorities have stepped up to support businesses through COVID and be able to empower local economic development. Lots to do, but I think it's a great opportunity we've had working with Scottish Government this last 7-8 months.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. I think Mr. Beattie did have, perhaps, does he wish to come back with, we might have a couple of minutes.
If there's time, I would just like to explore something that we did touch on, which was the digital sector. And I wanted to explore how the labour market situation was in the digital sector, because my impression is that it's quite buoyant, given the fact that we're all working digitally. You would think that would be scooping up all the resources possible to make this happen and to expand on that. But I think Jane said that also there was a precautionary element in that people were also on furlough, and I'd like to explore a little bit more on that.
In the early stages of lockdown, some companies using furlough as a precautionary planning tool because they weren't sure at that point of the impact in the industry as a whole or their supply chain. And we did see a very small percentage of companies, I think around 3%, who specifically supplied retail and other hard-hit sectors, and that there was more of an impact on their business. That has changed over the last 8 months, though, and the majority, I think almost 50% of respondents to our last survey were predicting a headcount increase of up to 5 people by the end of this year. So the industry is generally buoyant and still going for growth. 70% of respondents to the last survey were still very optimistic about last quarter, first quarter 21, and an increase in profit and sales for their businesses. So overall, apart from a small precautionary move at the beginning, I would say the industry is generally very buoyant, particularly comparatively.
Given that we are mostly working remotely and so on, is it a case that not all IT companies necessarily are benefiting from this? And can you maybe give us an idea of which ones are struggling a little bit in this environment and those that clearly are taking advantage of this and prospering?
I think we did see some of the larger suppliers who have typically staff working on clients' premises struggle in the earlier stages as well. We worked with Scottish Government on the return to premises guidelines for the technology industry, which I think helped enormously as companies were able to have people return to their premises. Again, the major impact that we saw, certainly in the earlier stages, was on companies who supplied digital products and services specifically into the hospitality and retail sectors. Many of them have now recovered as more retail organisations started to look at trading online and developing products and services that could be sold online. Obviously, the hospitality industry is still one that has suffered more significantly than many others. But again, the suppliers that were generally focused on them have now broadened their customer base and looked at pivoting their products and services to supply other industries. So we haven't, I think, we haven't seen a significant loss of companies in the industry above and beyond that which we would have expected through natural attrition, retirement, etc. anyway. And in terms of our membership base continues to increase rather than to drop off, which we had assessed early on in the stages. We've also seen a significant growth in startup companies during the COVID situation. So we have, I think, 40 additional new startup members that we've recruited over the last 3 months. And I think the rate of startups in the technology sector in Scotland has doubled over the last 8 months. So there's still significant growth.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the conclusion of this session. So thank you to all of our panel members, and I'll now suspend the meeting to change over to the next item on the agenda. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back to our meeting. Sorry, are we ready? Yeah, beg your pardon. Welcome back to our meeting this morning. We now move on to agenda item 3 regarding BIFAB, the offshore wind sector and Scottish supply chain. I welcome our second panel of witnesses who are joining us remotely. Jim Smith, Managing Director of SSE Renewables, Nick Sharp, Director of Communications and Strategy at Scottish Renewables, Matthew Hugh, Chief Executive Officer, EDF Renewables UK, and Alan McCaskill, Director, Concordant Offshore Wind Limited. Now, committee members, some are with me in the committee room and others are joining us remotely. I would ask witnesses just to give a few seconds to allow broadcasting colleagues to turn your microphones on before you start to speak, just so the microphones and everything will be operated by our sound desk. So I will now turn to questions from committee members, and perhaps if I might start off by asking the panel, and you don't all have to respond to every question, and committee members may seek to interject and ask further questions in the course of discussion when they are doing the questioning. So there's no need to wait for me as convener to come back, as it were, if a committee member is in the midst of asking questions and discussing matters with you. And furthermore, you can submit in writing following the session any further thoughts you may have or want to develop on what's been discussed today. So I'd like to ask panel members, first of all, what are the economic benefits of offshore wind developments to Scotland? What benefits, economic or otherwise, are these currently bringing to Scotland? And what's the possibilities for the future, bearing in mind the UK government announcements, very recent UK government announcements? If you want to either just indicate by raising your hand or typing R in the chat box, I think we have Nick Sharp wanting to come in, so perhaps Nick Sharp first of all. I'm afraid we're not hearing you. I don't know if the sound desk can do something about that, or... I'm just wondering, perhaps, I think Jim Smith wanted to come in. Can we try Jim Smith and see if we can resolve the issue with the sound with Nick Sharp? Is that possible?
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me, convener?
Yes, thank you. We can hear you.
Yeah, so in answer to your question, perhaps I can use the Beatrice wind farm as an example. Obviously, that was... It currently is Scotland's largest wind farm, although will soon be overtaken by Moray East. But we estimated that Beatrice will bring sort of around £1 billion to the Scottish economy over its lifetime. So I think that's a real demonstration that offshore wind does bring real economic benefit to the country. Clearly, we would like to be able to do more, which I'm sure is part of the discussion as we go forward this morning. But even at the levels that we're at just now in terms of UK supply, it brings a huge benefit to the country. And indeed, a recent decision to progress the Seagreen offshore wind farm, again, will likewise bring similar benefits to the country.
£1 billion sounds like a big figure, certainly pre-inflation. Can you just give us very quickly where that £1 billion comes from, a bit more specific to Scotland?
So I might not have all of the numbers broken down exactly, and I'd be happy to submit them in writing to the committee, but obviously there's a significant part of that comes through the construction phase, Beatrice obviously did manage to procure some of the foundations from Scotland. There are obviously significant works onshore in terms of the grid connection, and also a number of smaller suppliers. And then going through the life of the thing, these wind farms will operate for 30 years or more, and most of the costs associated with that operation are obviously borne in Scotland.
I suppose that's one of the questions we're here about, which is if construction parts are sent offshore for construction, the benefit is not necessarily to Scotland, is it? So what guarantees or what basis do we have for thinking that that will change in the future if it's not happened already?
Yeah, and I think the Offshore Wind Energy Catapult carried out a report on this to look at what the sort of potential currently is in the and this is in the UK basis, not Scotland particularly. And I think they estimated that currently the supply chain could probably provide about 50% of the content of value from an offshore wind investment. But clearly, if we want to, increase that percentage, then that's going to require investment in supply chain across a number of different areas.
Yes, is it not also about the contracts actually being awarded to companies that prefabricate things in Scotland? I mean, you mentioned a 50% possibility, but a possibility is not necessarily what actually happens.
Well, as I say, I think we estimated over the life of Beatrice it probably was around 50.
All right. Well, I think you mentioned one or two things that you could sort of share with the committee. If you did want to, that would be potentially helpful. And I think is Nick Sharp, do we have Nick Sharp on sound now? I'm just wondering if you could try unmuting yourself. I appreciate it's slightly... I think you've tried that, have you? Right. Well, I'm sorry to Nick Sharp. We'll try and get the technical people to assist there, because I see that you say you have muted and unmuted. So I'm not sure what the difficulty is. Did any of our other panel members have any comment to make on this at this stage about the economic or other benefits being brought to Scotland by offshore wind? I don't think we have any of you coming in on that. I mean, may I ask, sorry, Matthew Hugh, I think you have in fact indicated.
Good morning. I would just like to echo what Jim Smith said. I mean, throughout the development phase of offshore projects in that instance, developers seek to work with local supply chain. And that's from development to construction and operation. And I think the approach that is being taken is being proactive in engaging with local communities or local businesses as well as national businesses to offer them perspective and views on where the opportunity lie. And I think one area that we certainly need to consider is how we develop capabilities that will allow these businesses to secure more content than the 50% referred by Jim Smith. And I think there is certainly some work to be done to allow these capabilities to further develop and for Scottish businesses to win more contracts in through development, construction and operation of this wind farm. So I think there have been benefits, certainly. I can speak of the LNG project where we have invested directly through our Tier 1 contractors with the Scottish supply chain. And there is certainly more that can be done in the future to develop the local content.
May I just clarify something? I think my fault if I've not picked it up correctly. Is it 50% 50 or 15% that Jim Smith was talking about?
It's 50.
50. Oh, thank you very much.
If I'm not mistaken. Yep.
Well, Jim Smith can correct us both if that isn't correct. I think he's not indicating any.
Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. That my mistake. Now, now I think Nick Sharp has logged out and logged back in. So we'll try you again, Nick, and hopefully this time we're good to go.
Fingers crossed. We'll try again. Can you hear me this
Excellent.
time?
We can hear you loud and clear. So please carry on.
Good. Okay. Thank you, convener. Yeah. So as the industry body for renewable energy in Scotland, it's my place to set out the overall picture for offshore wind and the economic benefits it can bring and where we're going as well, because that's really important for the discussion today. So today we have just under 1 gigawatt of offshore wind capacity installed in Scottish waters. The offshore wind policy statement, which the Scottish Government published last month, agreed that 11 gigawatts of offshore wind deployment is possible by 2030. As part of the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, that figure is something that we are helping industry work towards. And obviously that's a very large increase. 1 gigawatt to 11 gigawatts is a very large increase. And that brings with it enormous potential for economic impact and environmental impact too. The most recent figures we have for turnover from the sector are from 2017, when turnover from renewable energy was £5.5 billion and offshore wind was providing around 10% of that. But if you picture that increase, more than a tenfold increase in the amount of offshore wind deployed in Scottish waters, you begin to get a picture of how the figures that Jim Smith there and Matthew talked about can expand to create something truly impressive. And one of the messages that I wanted to put across today was that Scottish supply chain companies and indeed UK supply chain companies are not out of the race. This is a sector which is growing, which has to grow if we want to deliver our net zero targets, and which still has tremendous opportunity.
Thank you. The Scottish Government had or hosted some wind supply chain summits. Have any of you attended these?
Yeah.
I think Nick Sharp is nodding, so
Yes.
You have, and I think Jim Smith has. I'm just wondering if you could tell us what these have achieved, these summits.
Yeah.
Nick Sharp,
Yeah,
first
happy
of
to
all.
do that,
Yeah.
convener. Thank you. Happy to do that. Yeah. One of the reasons that the most recent supply chain summit came together in January was to talk about new methods that the Scottish Government wanted to employ in order to ensure a future for Scottish supply chain companies. And that was something that's called the Supply Chain Development Statement, and I'm sure we'll get into talking about that later, as well as a UK government announcement this morning on changes to the Contracts for Difference mechanism, which will have a similar effect. Primarily, the output from the summit in January came from the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which is chaired by Jim's colleague Brian McFarlane from SSE and the Minister for Energy Connectivity in the Islands, Mr. Wheelhouse. The commitment from SOEC was to bring together a supply chain review. That process is currently underway. It's been led by Sir Jim MacDonald from the University of Strathclyde. And that will look at capacity in the Scottish supply chain as well as ways in which industry and government can help foster success there as we do grow towards that 11 gigawatts and beyond.
So far what you're saying has come out of the summit is a review that is ongoing.
That is my understanding, yes. That's my understanding.
Nothing.
As well as supply chain development statements, but I think it's probably that's probably a separate issue which we can discuss.
Jim Smith, are you able to comment on what has come out of the review summit? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Just to reiterate what Nick said, I mean, part of that was around the supply chain development plans that have been talked about for the upcoming ScotWind seabed leasing rounds. You know, I mean, we have been supportive of that, but we've also made it clear that it's very important that we mustn't disadvantage Scottish projects over projects down south, because we are in a very competitive market here. With long as that competition still exists, we need to make sure that we have a level playing field between projects being developed in Scotland and down south. There are already some significant disadvantages for projects in Scotland, which are subject to higher transmission charges. Tends to be deeper water as well, which makes the projects more expensive. So, you know, with that proviso that we don't disadvantage the projects, we are very supportive of the Scottish supply chain development plans.
Right. I think part of the problem may not be the question, well, that may be part of the discussion, but part of the problem is the contracts going overseas, well beyond these shores, rather than coming to Scottish companies, as opposed to the question of south of the border within these isles. But I don't want to, I think we want to move on because other committee members want to come in, so I'd like to give them an opportunity. We'll go to Maurice Golden at this stage.
Thank you, Convener. And my question is around jobs linked to the offshore wind supply chain, and I'll start off with Nick Sharp, and then I can bring in any of the rest of the panel as required. Clearly, in terms of green jobs more generally, Alex Salmond promised 28,000 green jobs by 2020. In terms of the offshore wind supply chain jobs, do you have any insight on previous forecasts for the number of jobs in the sector by 2020? I appreciate that, you know, with contracting, that jobs do fluctuate, and also if we look back from today, but could you also forecast number of jobs going forward as well? Is there any data or intelligence at what we might expect, particularly within the offshore wind supply chain in Scotland? Nick Sharp.
Thank you, Maurice. Yes, absolutely, I can talk to that. The 28,000 figure that you mentioned was actually taken from a report, I believe, that Scottish Renewables was involved in drafting probably around a decade ago now. The 28,000 figure was the highest scenario that was presented in that report. And in fact, the lowest scenario is what we have today. It's roughly the number of offshore wind jobs that we have in Scotland. And I think it's important to understand that any projection of future employment is contingent on deployment. We're very clear that deployment equals employment. And we actually did some work earlier this year that shows that for every gigawatt of renewable electricity deployed in Scotland, 1,500 jobs have been created. What has happened in the intervening decade has not been necessarily to Scotland's advantage. And we have seen considerable lengthy delays in the offshore wind sector's deployment, caused by consenting issues, which took a lot longer to get through Scottish Government than we had hoped, and then by a judicial review, which was brought against Marine Scotland and successfully defended. That probably put us at least 3, if not 4 years behind the rest of the UK, and we've really seen the English and Welsh offshore wind projects leap ahead, and they've developed an enormous industry down there. Places like Lowestoft in Suffolk and Humber are absolutely fundamental now to the largest offshore wind sector in the world. Well, in Scotland, as I said earlier, we are just beginning to develop that capacity. So it's really important to look at what we've deployed compared to what we employ, and that report that therefore is actually not that far wrong if you look at its lowest projection. In terms of where we're going in the future, at the moment, we know that offshore wind, and these are 2017 figures, but offshore wind employs 3,400 people in Scotland. That is likely to be much higher now. Nobody has discussed yet the sector deal that was struck between the UK government and the offshore wind sector in 2018. That's been a really important way of bringing together supply chain companies and the industry and government with a common goal. The original goal there was to raise UK deployment to 30 gigawatts by 2030. That's now been raised by the Prime Minister recently to 40 gigawatts by 2030. So really, really stretching target. And as part of that, industry is committed to increase the UK content of projects from 48% currently to 60% by 2030. We simply can't do that unless we have a robust competitive supply chain in the UK and in Scotland. That will require investments in parts of the supply chain in which we don't currently excel, but also more importantly, a focus on those areas in which we do excel, where we can boost their capacity and also their export capacity as well, which we can come to later. So the commitment under that supply chain, the sector deal, is to support 27,000 jobs by 2030 across the UK, with the majority of those in coastal communities, as well as increasing representation of women to at least a third. So I hope that provides some idea of where we're going as a UK and why that report has not delivered what we hoped in terms of jobs.
Thank you, Nick. Convener, is any of the rest of the panel looking to come in on this one? Can you see?
Well, perhaps we could ask them if they have any comments. I don't know if... Are there any other takers to comment on this? Jim Smith, I think you've indicated.
Yeah. Again, just really to reiterate what Nick has said, I mean, the number of jobs will be proportionate to the investment in projects. And if I think back to about 2010, the target, I think Scotland was talking about at the time for offshore wind, is that we would have about 3 gigawatts of offshore wind in operation by 2020. As Nick says, we're here today and we have less than a gigawatt in operation, which is something like 5% of the UK's installed capacity in offshore wind. So we have been somewhat left behind relative to the rest of the UK. In the last decade, there's clearly the opportunity to catch up, and there's obviously 2 projects currently in construction which will help, and hopefully more to come. But clearly, if projects aren't being built, then the number of jobs aren't going to be as high. But I just need to look at my own organisation, SSE Renewables, and obviously that doesn't just cover offshore wind, but in the last 15 years, we've increased our own employees by a factor of 5 and now employ more than 1,000 people directly.
Sorry.
Thanks, Jim. Just a quick supplementary on that. In a previous question, you mentioned TNUoS charging. Has that charging regime significantly changed over the last decade, and therefore is it impacting on the generation of offshore wind in Scotland?
I think high transmission charges have been an issue in Scotland for a long time, and there are constantly changes to transmission charging mechanisms. But fundamentally, the issue of high transmission charges is probably, if anything, getting a little bit worse rather than better. But fundamentally, it's been an issue that's been around for a long time.
And Jim, do Scottish customers benefit from the TNUoS charging?
Difficult to use the word benefit. I mean, I think clearly the transmission system has to be paid for, and it's really a question of how you distribute the charges for that between customers and generators. I mean, ultimately, we have generators have to have a cost, and that flows through to customers through the price of electricity. I think the issue that most generation developers in Scotland would have is that we pay considerably more than our counterpart down south. Now, as I say, if we end up paying less, someone will have to pay more, but the total cost of generation to the UK as a whole won't change.
Thanks, Jim. That's helpful. Moving on, in terms of the contracts for difference rounds, there's been 3 over the past 3 allocations, the Scottish offshore development as a share of this has fallen. Can you possibly explain why that is the case, and what can be done to reverse this trend? Should we keep with you, Jim, if you've got any thoughts on CFD?
Yeah, look, I mean, as I say, I think, we've talked about Genuos as a significantly higher cost in Scotland compared to further south. I think more broadly, the projects in Scotland, so if you look at Beatrice, when it was built, deepest offshore wind farm in the world, that comes at a cost in terms of capital costs, construction costs. Moray East is the same. It's a jacket structure in similar depths of water. Seagreen is in even deeper water. So all of that comes at a cost, whereas the projects that have been built down south today have tended to be in, relatively speaking, shallower water and therefore use monopile foundations rather than jacket structures. I think unlike onshore wind, where you see a fairly significant benefit the further north you move because of higher wind resource, you don't tend to see that as you in the offshore industry. So, the wind resource and some of the wind farms down south is just as good as the wind resource for Scottish projects on the East Coast as well.
Thanks, Jim. Nick Sharp, can I bring you in next?
Yep, still here. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, just wondering your thoughts on CFD, how Scotland can get a bigger share going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there are figures. So looking back, I can talk to those 3 auction rounds that we've already had, and then AR4 and AR5, which are coming through. So we did some research, and I believe it was earlier this year. The amount of offshore wind capacity awarded to Scottish projects fell across the 3 auction rounds, which we've had already, which I believe Maurice is talking about. So in auction round 1, 39% of the projects were Scottish. In auction round 2, that figure was 30%. In auction round 3, it was 9%. That's really significant, I think, for this discussion today, and really puts across the situation with deployment and employment. If we're only getting 9% of the projects through from a CFD round, then we simply cannot deliver the economic and environmental benefits that this industry wants to deliver for Scotland. Jim's already touched on some of the issues which have probably led to that. We've always known that Scottish waters were much deeper, seabed conditions are much more difficult, often face rock rather than mud, which makes projects more expensive. Other issues as well, you talked about Tenuos, which is the way that the transmission network is paid for. We believe that situation is going to become significantly worse over the next decade, to the extent that developers will be paying tens of millions of pounds more a year than their English counterparts, and that's something we can provide evidence on after the session. It's something that we're working on through the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council. But the grid situation as it stands, I think, leads into the way that the contractor difference mechanism works. So the CFD was set up in a very different time, back in 2015, when government focus was very much on cost of energy to consumers. And as an aside, we must remember here, there's only one way for money to flow into the energy industry, and that's through consumer bills. So government then was very focused on the cost of energy for consumers. They'd actually committed to the cheapest electricity prices in Europe. You might remember Ed Miliband as Labour leader's price cap was his key policy back then. So government invented the CFD, and its job is to drive down the cost of power as low as it possibly can go in a competitive auction. It's been phenomenally successful at that. It really has. In terms of offshore wind, Beatrice received a strike price before first auction round of £140 a megawatt hour. The cheapest project in the first auction round was 114, in the second was 57. In the third auction round, Seagreen 1 received a contract of £41 a megawatt hour. So you can see there that process has driven down the cost of offshore wind to a point that I don't think anybody expected. And in 2016, BEIS, the UK government department that's responsible for energy, thought that the cost of offshore wind in 2030 would be £103 a megawatt hour. Its current estimate is £47. So nobody saw this coming. But what this has led to is a lack of money in the system and necessarily then a desire to bring down costs of projects. And I think that's what Jim had talked about earlier as well. So the grid issue is tied in with that through Ofgem and its commitment to drive down cost for consumers. It doesn't currently consider climate change and efforts to cut carbon as part of its remit. That's something we want to change.
May I just ask Nick Sharp, because you're not in the room and you're online, and this is not directed at you personally, because this could apply to quite a number of witnesses who are online, are you using reference to numbers or figures you may have on a screen before you to assist in answering some of the questions? It's just something that's sort of arisen to my mind that is slightly different because of the new circumstances we're all working in. And normally we would have all witnesses in the committee room. That's not the circumstances just because the way things are from your point of view or our point of view. And I'm just interested because from a committee point of view, it helps us to know, if the information is coming from a particular source, for example, which would be, usually indicated to us in the committee if someone is sitting here as a witness, or they would say, I'll follow up with the written information. So I'm just wondering, you've given us a number of figures there.
Yeah, certainly. When I spoke to this committee in 2019, I had a folder with tabs and paper all very neatly organised, and I could flick through that folder on the desk in front of me. The situation is the same now. I've got a Word document that I've spent a couple of weeks preparing with data in it, and I can flick backwards and forwards to that. I can, of course, provide references to any of the figures afterwards, or indeed a shortened version of that briefing that I'm using. So, yeah, it's exactly the same situation, Convener.
Right. Well, that's very helpful to know that. And I think for any other witnesses that are on the panel, if they're referring to documents, then it'd be helpful if these could be shared with the committee, because it's as a committee, it's important that we are, know where the information is coming from and are able to look back at it and indeed be transparent with those who are looking at what reports we issue or the information that we rely upon. So thanks very much for being open about that. I'll now move on to other witnesses, because although we have a bit of time, we don't have unlimited time here this morning, if I can put it that way. So now come on to Rhoda Grant for questions, and Rhoda joins us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just ask a quick supplementary on an answer that was given previously? I think it was Jim Smith talked about 50% of the supply chain is local supply chain. I'm interested to know where those jobs actually are for Seagreen, Yashnagai and Murray East. Where are those jobs if they're 50% of the jobs involved are in the local supply chain?
Yeah, so what I said was that 50% in value of content, if you like, over the life of the wind farm. I think talking about Beatrice, we obviously know we gave some foundation contract to BIFAB. We invested in Wick as our operational base, the substation and the cable laying to the shore up in Murray. Was another part of the investment. And then there's numerous, obviously, smaller supplies from blower tier 1 suppliers who use local content. And as I'm happy for us to provide a sort of a more detailed breakdown, if you like, of the £1 billion of value that I mentioned to the committee.
Yeah, it would be really helpful to get that 50% breakdown where the local 50% is and where the non-local 50% is, so that we can make that comparison and what has been let currently and what is maybe a future projection that hasn't been let as yet. Can I just move on? Sorry, on you go, Jim.
No, I'm just going to clarify. It doesn't necessarily obviously mean 50% of jobs. It's 50% in terms of value.
Okay, it will be good to get a breakdown so that we can see very clearly where that is. Okay.
And that's obviously on a UK basis.
Okay, is it possible to get that on a Scottish basis? Because obviously the committee is interested in, we are the Scottish Parliament, we're interested in what...
We will be able to break that out, yeah.
What percentage do you think is on a Scottish basis? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I'd rather not guess, jump a number and get it wrong. So if you don't mind, I'll make sure we submit it in the document.
Okay, thank you. You'll be aware that Unite the Union has assessed the offshore industry as a spaghetti bowl of vested interest groups with established supply chain preferences. Do you recognise that statement and would you agree with it? Jim, since you're on this.
No, no, I wouldn't. I mean, we go out to competitive tender for our tier 1 suppliers. And indeed, on Seagreen, we are using some suppliers that we haven't used before. And in Dogger Bank, which is our, we hope to make an announcement about very soon about going through some projects. There are a number of suppliers in there that we have never used before in the supply chain, and we've already made announcements about those. So I think the statement is somewhat misleading. As I say, we go out to competitive tender and we look for the best price that can deliver on the required quality that we require to deliver the project.
Okay, how do you assess quality, sorry, if you haven't used a company before?
Well, obviously, like anything, when you go through a procurement process, you need to you looking at a company's experience, what they've done in the past, accreditations. You visit them. They may not have worked for you, but they will have experience elsewhere. So you can clearly make an assessment based on that.
So how does somebody new break into that industry? If you're assessing on work done before within the industry, I think that's what Unite is getting to. You might not always be using the same, but there is a small number of companies that people use because they know they've been used in the past. How can someone break in? That's our issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly that can be a bit of a challenge, but I mean, at the end of the day, everyone working in offshore wind are relatively new to the game. I mean, the industry's only really been in existence for the last 10 to 15 years and has grown rapidly in the last 5 or 6. So, I think as Nick says, when you look at what's ahead, although there's just over 10 gigawatts of operational wind in the UK, the target now is 40 gigawatts by 2030. So that's going to require a significant expansion of the supply chain, and that will mean many new players in the supply chain as well.
Sorry,
okay.
sorry to intervene. Sorry, Rhoda. I see that Nick Sharp wants to come in, but I was also going to say, I think Alan McCaskill, I think it's perhaps the first time Alan McCaskill's been as a witness to a committee. He may wish to, I think, make comment on some of this, perhaps, once, Rhoda, you've concluded your discussion with Jim Smith and perhaps Nick Sharp has made his comments. So back to Rhoda Grant.
Okay. I think we wanted to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Rhoda. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of paint a bit of a picture, if you will, of the situation we're in today in contrast to Unite's statement there. And I think it's very easy to think of this as kind of a David and Goliath situation with large companies not giving contracts to small companies, and that is absolutely not the case. What I've found through 2 or 3 years now of looking at the offshore wind supply chain is a great deal of goodwill in Scotland from those larger developers towards the smaller companies. And indeed, a tremendous amount is being done by those larger companies to help the smaller companies. And make no mistake, the success of the supply chain in Scotland and indeed in the rest of the UK is really a matter for 3 parties. It's for the supply chain companies themselves, it's for government, and it's for the developers. And I just wanted to give a brief overview of actions that the developers are taking at the moment to help supply chain companies across the UK, but also specifically in Scotland. I will note that I've written these out, and it comes to 1,000 words. We can send this stuff in. I don't want to go into all of it, but we've already talked about the supply chain review that's going on through the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council. That council also has a supply chain work stream into which developers in our membership of Scottish Renewables are incredibly committed. As part of the sector deal, there's the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership. Many of you will have heard of that. That's committed £100 million to support supply chain companies and help them foster innovation, boost productivity, increase their competitiveness. And that speaks specifically to the member's point about how a company who hasn't worked in offshore wind before can get in. That's £100 million committed by industry to be spent helping supply chain companies across the country. As part of that, the sector deal, there's a Collaborating for Growth programme, there's a Sharing in Growth programme, which has also been brought from aerospace to learn best practice. The sector deal has a people and skills work stream, which is looking across the UK at how many people are employed in offshore wind and how we can bring more people across from oil and gas as we transition away from that industry. Developers are also very supportive of the offshore wind clusters, Deep Wind, Forth and Tay in Scotland. Between them, more than 700 members in those two clusters, with developers taking a very keen interest there, and many Meet the Buyer events taking place, networking events to introduce supply chain companies to developers who they might not otherwise have met. The Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult's running a Fit for Offshore Renewables programme for supply chain companies. The UK government is investing £160 million in ports infrastructure, which will benefit supply chain companies. And at Scottish Renewables, we're taking steps too. So it's absolutely not the case that the supply chain is adrift here. There's a lot going on to help supply chain companies compete. We're just at the start of this journey. There's lots more to come. So just wanted to make those points.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Alan McCaskill, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I haven't really said very much, largely because it's been concentrating on fixed structures, which I have been involved in. Jim Smith and I were part of building the Talisman two demonstrator models in adjacent to the Beatrice field, which is a precursor of the Beatrice offshore wind farm. Those had a high UK content, Scottish content. However, and they therefore got significant opportunities thereafter. I can't really comment on what happened since then, because the quality and various things I don't really understand, but the opportunity was squandered, and the Scottish companies did not continue to succeed in that industry, and I don't know why. I haven't been involved in that, and I can't really say any more. There was a lot of effort, I think, to make that happen, but others would have to comment on that. I'm now involved in floating. And floating, I think, is the future. Just as we pioneered jackets in Talisman, we're now pioneering the floating systems at Kincardine. And there is a significant amount of Scottish content in that, largely because the project is just off Aberdeen. And we're working hard to maximise it and to use the opportunity here. It's also the start of the next phase. Jim was saying how jackets and things are more expensive and things. The truth is, I saw this happen in the oil and gas business. When I first came, everything was fixed structures and that was all we were going to build. I went to Canada, and when I came back, you saw the end of the fixed era and the arrival of the floating era. And I think that's what we're going to see here as the turbines get bigger. We'll improve the technology of floating, and over time, we will be able to access significantly more of Scotland's acreage and deliver that over the next 10 or 20 years.
Can I just ask Alan, do we then have more expertise in building floating structures? I would have thought with the oil and gas industry that we would have had expertise in all these areas.
We have very little expertise in building floating structures, most of those built for the oil and gas business. We're not built here. The only one I was ever involved in was the Talisman Rossfield, which used the Blairholm. The hull was built in Korea and towed to the UK, and the actual topside was put on in the Clyde. But I think it was about the last topside to go on in the Clyde.
So is there a chance we lose out on floating structures in offshore wind then? Or have we built the capacity?
Domestic advantages in doing a large amount of the work in and around the ports that we have. We would have done more had the ports been open to us, but they weren't. They didn't fit with their capacity and the technology we were using.
In what way were the ports not open to you?
They were busy doing other things.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Convener?
All right, thank you. Now move on to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask the panel just a direct question. Why are other European countries beating Scottish bids for the fabrication of jackets, especially when Scotland's got such an advantage with an established and fairly innovative oil and gas industry? Anyone got an idea? Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I can take this one. Many reasons, Colin. We'll probably start with first mover advantage. Denmark built its first offshore wind farm, the first in the world, in 1991. Europe has moved since then to invest in manufacturing capacity and imports capacity when the UK hasn't. And that really is a fundamental failure of industrial strategy at a government level for many decades. We're talking here about very large, very complex pieces of equipment that have been produced to a very high standard. Speaking to some of our members ahead of this session today, we talked about facilities in Scotland and how they compare with facilities in the rest of the world. And the phrase, we're not comparing apples and apples, came up. We're talking about a completely different shift in size and capacity. And because I have this document in front of me, I'll just take a second to read you a sentence from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapults report into fabrication facilities in Scotland, which was published just ahead of the Supply Chain Summit in January. So it says the best-in-class fabrication facilities for monopiles and jackets are sited at large ports with excellent logistics, including efficient goods in and goods out routes and processes for movements of thousands of tons of raw materials. The UK has no equivalent to Edgeburg in Denmark, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Rostock in Germany. As I said earlier, everyone has a part to play in the success of supply chain companies, government, industry, and supply chain companies themselves. And it's unfortunately the case that investments that could have been made over past decades that would have seen the UK be able to compete with European supply chain companies on things like fabrication just simply weren't made. And we're left with that apples and oranges situation, and it's really unfortunate. And through the routes I talked about in the answer to the previous question there, we are doing things about it now, but the fact remains that 3% of Denmark's GDP comes from exporting wind energy products. They have that first mover advantage. So we're always going to be at a disadvantage. And that's why we should focus on areas where we can succeed and develop green, high-tech, high-quality jobs of the future.
So can I take it from that as things stand at the moment, there is absolutely no chance that Scotland is competitive in the market?
No, that's not the case at all. No, and I think the reason why it's not the case is you look at, for a supply chain company to feed into an offshore wind farm, you're looking for three things. You're looking for cost, you're looking for quality, and you're looking for reliability. And what we've found at Scottish Renewables, while we've been doing research into the supply chain ahead of committee meetings like this, is that primarily quality hasn't been an issue. We know that Scottish engineering firms are very skilled. They have that experience from oil and gas, albeit large structures have not been built in the UK since the 90s. Where there has been a discrepancy is in cost, but we find that's only 10 to 15%. That's what the offshore renewable energy catapult found back in January in their report. So we're looking at 10 to 15% more expensive than those European ports. And what comes into play there is very much the goodwill, I think, that Scottish companies building in Scotland have for these smaller supply chain companies. And we've demonstrated time and time again that we will take on board that extra cost for the benefit of using a local company to do work. And we're actually just refreshing a publication from last year, which shows almost 20 great supply chain examples of companies which are succeeding here and which are globally competitive and are working in offshore wind, not just in Scotland or the rest of the UK, but across Northern Europe. So there are lots of successes. It's not right to focus on the companies that haven't made a success of this, but there are challenges.
Can I just, again, press you a little bit on that? Because you're saying that parts of the supply chain are good and effective. Specifically for the fabrication of jackets, do we have the capability in Scotland at this moment to compete on the fabrication of jackets?
So to, I guess, look at where we are with jackets, and obviously I've done a considerable amount of reading on this over the last few weeks, especially. There was a position in recent years where Scottish yards competed against European yards very fiercely for jacket contracts, and places like Belgium, Spain were very competitive in that. And I think we talked at the previous meeting of this committee on BIFAB about state aid rules and how that had led in there. That situation has very much changed, and I spoke to colleagues at Wind Europe yesterday. They represent renewable energy businesses across Europe, and what they've seen is a shift away from Europe to the Far East and the Middle East. And that's been driven by these contract for difference mechanisms, which have been adopted in many shapes by different countries. The cost of offshore wind has been driven down across the world. It's no surprise that the companies in the Far East are able to produce these large projects at a lower cost. And now it's not just Scotland and the rest of the UK that are struggling to compete with Europe. Europe is struggling to compete with the Far East. And that's where we're going. And the prices that we've seen, the price I discussed earlier for Seagreen of 40 odd pounds, it would be very difficult to build those jackets in Europe. If those companies didn't go to the Far East for those jackets, they couldn't build the project. There'd be no project, there'd be no economic benefits, there'd be no environmental benefits in Scotland. And that's a really difficult situation.
Can I just ask what the scale of difference in price is between Europe and the Far East?
I'm afraid I don't have that figure.
Do any of the rest of the panel have some indication of this, assuming that they agree with Nick's assessment?
Sorry, I'm just wondering...
I would actually...
No, sorry, carry on, Jim Smith, I think you were speaking.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would estimate that there's at least 10%, perhaps more, difference between Europe and the Far East.
So that's quite substantial.
I'm just wondering about bringing in our colleague Graham Simpson, who's also, I think, interested in this particular area. And it may be that Matthew Hugh, who has indicated a desire to make some comment on this, might want to come in response to a further question from Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. Mr. Beattie has rather stolen my thunder on these questions. But it's been very interesting listening to all this, because I'm new to this inquiry. Now, if I can turn to Nick Sharp, and by the way, hello, Nick, again. Nick and I, Convener, used to work together, but clearly in a different sector. Nick, you, from what you've been saying, it suggests to me that part of the issue is the CFD, the money that's in the system in Britain appears to be too low. Now that's good for the consumer, but too low to allow to enable companies to give more work to British and of course Scottish companies, and therefore they're going elsewhere in the world. Now the Far East, it was the rest of Europe, but now appears to be going to the Far East. Is that a correct analysis?
That would be a fair assessment, Graham, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that there's been changes to that contract announced today. Now, I just had a quick look earlier. Obviously, it's quite a large document that the UK government's produced. Are you able to summarise what those changes are?
I'm in a similar position to you in that we haven't had long to look at these. I did ask our policy team this morning to take a look, so I've got some brief points to make on that. What the UK government is aiming to do through its review of the CFD and supply chain element of that particularly is similar to what the Scottish government has done with supply chain development statements. That is bring some clarity into the process to allow supply chain companies the confidence to invest in things like manufacturing capability, in upskilling their workers ahead of offshore wind projects being built. The challenge, which I think the UK government faced and certainly the Scottish government faced, and we've been quite vocal about this in the past, is that it is the building of an offshore wind farm can take a decade, can take more than a decade. I believe the Aberdeen Bay wind farm was 13 years from conception to energisation. So very, very long periods of time. Asking companies to make commitments to specific supply chain companies that early in the process, when they're just applying to lease the seabed to build their project, is really, really challenging. It's often the case that when those projects are delivered, those companies might not exist anymore. They might have merged with other companies. They might have moved into different sectors. So the supply chain development statement that the Scottish government have brought through the ScotWind leasing process allows companies to revise their supply chain development statement as time goes on. However, there's still a huge issue with companies being forced to commit to supply chain plans very, very early in the process. We believe that actually could create the perverse effect where companies actually low bar themselves and don't commit to as much local content as part of that process because they are not sure that they can meet it further down the line. That's something UK government has addressed today in its review of the CFD. It's still promising more details, but yes, that timescale issue is really, really critical. And allowing developers more flexibility as they move forward is really important. So yeah, UK government and Scottish government both battling the same issue, I think there.
Right, that's useful. Now, Nick Sharp seems to be speaking for our other witnesses, so perhaps they may want to say something on why they've not selected Scottish companies to manufacture jackets and piles. Is it all just down to price, or do you take other factors into consideration, like working conditions?
I'll bring in Matthew.
Perhaps.
Sorry, could I bring in Matthew Hugh here, because I think he's been wanting to come in, if I might, Matthew.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I mean, what I would like to say is that as a developer, and I think many are like EDF Renewables, we are definitively seeking to work with Scottish supply chain and UK supply chain. And in fact, when we start the development of a project, we are, as I said, proactive, reaching out to these companies that may benefit from the project. If I take the example of NNG, where we started construction earlier this year, we went through a very thorough exercise of tendering the various scope part of the projects, from jacket to offshore substation to turbines. And on each of these contracts, what we ask the tier one suppliers is to consider where they could get some local content. And in some cases, we go further than that, and we are quite specific as to where they could find this local content. And in the case of the jacket for NNG, we ask our potential contractors to actually work with BIFAB, to look at the opportunities to work with BIFAB. What we found is what we just discussed, is that BIFAB was not able to compete on price. And the price differential was, yes, 10 to 15% of what we see elsewhere in Europe, and even more of what you see outside Europe. So it's a global market. So in a world where developers have to compete through a CFD that are awarded to the lowest price offered, it's very difficult for developers to always accept to pay a premium. They are in fact unable to pay a premium, or they will lose the contract and not the CFD contract and not be able to develop the project at all. It doesn't mean that we are not making effort in some cases, as we did actually requested and work very hard with Saipem to allow BIFAB to secure part of the jacket contract. But it's not easy. It's a lot of work. And I think what we are saying is what is missing is effectively a competitive supply chain. And without strong investment, this supply chain can not necessarily compete. So I think having a bit of a holistic approach to, what are the opportunities for Scottish and UK supply chain, and target this area where maybe investment would be best targeted, I think it's certainly something that we need to consider further. Because we cannot just pay a premium on an ad hoc basis to support the supply chain in the long run. What we need is investment that support then competitiveness, then support winning contracts in tendering process.
Convener, can I just come back on that?
Briefly, and then we'll come to a supplementary from Colin Beattie, followed by a supplementary from Rhoda Grant. So, Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew, you mentioned investment. If we take BIFAB, there has been investment. There's been a lot of government investment. So why has that not worked?
Well, what we see is that it's more than just a yard. We spoke about port facilities. The fabrication of a foundation is not the only cost to be accounted for by the contractor. And I think we see in the case of BIFAB the fact that, for example, the yard was mothballed, and we need to remobilize the workforce. We need to remobilize the yard. It costs money. So there might be some investment, but I think that there was not necessarily all the investment required to be competitive against European supply chain. And the fact that this activity discontinued had certainly a significant amount of cost to fabricating jacket in this instance.
Perhaps just before Colin Beattie comes in with his supplementary, I think Jim Smith wanted to comment. And could I just ask if it is just price that is making the difference to who gets the contracts? Jim Smith.
Yeah, I think, that's the point I wanted to make. I look at wholly support what Matthew has said there, and I think really the point I wanted to get across was that CFD auctions, or certainly the last CFD auction, was extremely competitive. So much so, in fact, that Seagreen actually only managed to get a CFD for 40% of its capacity. That actually made the decision about whether to progress the project into construction a really difficult one for us. Had we not, and the only way we managed to get the 40% was obviously to get to the lowest possible bid price. So any additional cost that would have resulted in a higher bid price would have almost certainly led to us not getting any CFD, and actually Seagreen wouldn't be progressing at all. So we wouldn't be talking about what has or hasn't gone to Scottish companies. It would be, why hasn't Scotland won any CFDs for any Scottish offshore wind farms?
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. This is really a question for EDF in connection with government guarantees. Why is it that a government guarantee was so critical? Do other countries supply such government guarantees, and in what circumstances would the guarantees be called in?
Thank you for the question. But it's just a normal in contracts such as jacket or that the developer asked for guarantees for that work to be completed. So it wasn't a request just specific in the instance of BIFAB. We ask of all our suppliers, contractors to provide such guarantees so that if the work does not complete, we have protection. So in this instance, the guarantee was coming from a Scottish government as shoulders in BIFAB, and the that's as a shareholders that Scottish government came in to provide that guarantee. So it's no difference to any other contractors.
Can I just ask at that point, do other European countries within the EU provide these guarantees?
It would be the shareholder, or a company winning, being awarded a contract would be requested to provide a guarantee. He then choose the source of its guarantee. It can be through banks, it can be parent company guarantees. Here for BIFAB, it was effectively the Scottish government as a shoulders in BIFAB providing that guarantee.
In your experience with other European countries in the EU, have there been government guarantees provided in the past?
I don't know is a simple answer. I can look into it and revert back with an answer to that question. I don't know that.
I think we'd be very interested.
All right, thank you. Yes, that would be helpful if you could respond on that if in writing. And Rhoda Grant.
In Indonesia, the committee understands welders are paid £2.80 an hour. That's about a fifth of what they would be paid in this country. Would having a fair work guarantee incorporated in these leases ensure that Scottish companies were treated more fairly when it came to manufacturing? Matthew, you're on my screen, so I don't know if you want to take that.
Well, I think certainly what we need to consider is what would work for Scotland, and what we can't ignore is the fact that the market we're operating in is designed in a way that we have, in the case of CFD, we have to find a contractor capable of providing the work to the quality required to a competitive price. Okay. Today, the rules do not oblige us to disregard certain contractors or to factor in elements such as the one you described. If we were to do that, we think we will have to be careful as the CFD applies not just to Scotland but to the UK in general, that we do not introduce rules that will make Scotland uncompetitive in the context of the UK CFD. So I think we have to be mindful that the rules that we use need to provide for a level playing field so that Scotland is not disadvantaged against other parts of the UK. So if such rule was to be applied, I think it should be applied across. Otherwise, it would be to the detriment of Scotland, and Scotland being unable to win a contract at all, and therefore this project will not happen at all. But I think as developers, I think we would be very willing to discuss, change to the rules and see what are the best way of accommodating for common goals.
Are shareholders aware of the work practices that are used in some of those contracts? I mean, that's an incredibly low wage for the job, and we hear about yards in the Middle East with really poor work practices, health and safety. I mean, is it ethical for companies whose shareholders are maybe used to being paid more and treated better to be making money from very poor work practices?
I can speak for EDF, but I think all developers do the same. They will make sure that they employ contractors that treat people fairly and to the standard required when it comes to health and safety. I think that's definitively a requirement that we put in our tendering process. So we will not contract with the supplier unless they were to meet these requirements.
How do you
so
measure
there are
that?
requirements that we put in our tendering process. Certainly on health and safety, we have some very strict requirements. When it comes to conditions of working, I will have to come back to you as to what specific items might be put in our tendering process, but we are certainly covering these aspects.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think it might also be helpful if you could indicate how you follow up to ensure that these standards are met in terms of the contracts that you enter into, and others. It would be helpful to hear from them as well on these points from our other witnesses on the panel. We'll now move on to John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. And maybe to build on some of the points that Rhoda Grant was asking about, I mean, presumably, if we bring jackets from either the Middle East or from China or wherever, there's quite a carbon cost to that, the actual transport and so on. I mean, is that just something that's overruled completely by price? Is that another fault of the CFD? I don't really mind. I mean, I suppose EDF or SSE.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Look, I mean, I think we probably explained how important price is to winning a contract in the first place. But I think on the issue of carbon, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that whether we are bringing steel fabrications to the UK or indeed the raw steel to make those fabrications, or indeed the iron ore to make the steel, then it all has to be transported to the UK from other parts of the world. So there isn't a carbon-free option, if you like, in this, and a choice to be made. Again, I'll go back to Beatrice and use the example of the jackets manufactured by BIFAB. Significant portions of that, in terms of prefabrications, castings, etc., were procured by BIFAB from the Far East. So I don't think simply procuring by whether a Scottish company, UK company, or European company avoids that carbon footprint.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. And I mean, another issue to move on to is state aid. Now, we get the impression sometimes that both the Scottish Government and the UK Government are quite nervous about the state aid rules and do not want to be challenged on that. And, compared to perhaps other countries, even other European countries, I don't know if there are any thoughts, either SSE, EDF, or maybe Al McCaskill as well from Cowl. Do you think our governments here are overly nervous about state aid?
Personally, I think that's a matter for the governments. It's not really one for us to comment on.
Yeah, but we have also had Mr. McCaskill come in just a second. I mean, we have also had the claim that there needs to be more investment, and I take it that investment in ports, for example, could be either public or private investment. So, I mean, if you're calling for more investment, I'd really like to know if we think other countries are investing a bit more supportively. But Mr. McCaskill, on you go.
All I was going to say is I've seen not state aid or anything like that, but the nature of the ownership of ports in other countries, they tend to be differently owned and they raise the funds for those investments. That's a different issue. It's not to do with state aid.
But that I take it you're suggesting that the state or the local authority perhaps owns the ports in more cases and we're more privatised?
I don't know the answer. I'm just telling you what I've seen, and that's all I can comment on. A significant investment made by the port.
Okay, well, we can maybe look at that further. I mean, Cowell, as I understand it, has got jackets from within Europe, perhaps from Spain. Now, the suggestion is that purchases are made from a state-owned company that is loss-making, which is kind of like a subsidy. Can you tell us if that's the case?
I can't comment on that. I don't know anything about the accounts of the company you're talking about, but there are several companies involved in the manufacture of those substructures, and we did try very hard to find locations in the Scotland and the United Kingdom. There weren't any.
Okay, thank you.
Richard Lyle. Sorry, did
Thank you.
Jim Smith want to comment on that? Or is, well, perhaps we'll come on to Richard Lyle's question. Jim Smith can comment on that if he wants to add comment to that. Richard Lyle.
Right, part of my question actually has already been covered, but let's hit the nail on the head. We're hearing all the get-outs of why no contracts, poor ports, poor facilities, work practices. Some people say if we simply go on best price, we could possibly not win any contracts for anything. You may say that's a ridiculous statement, but it seems true. What needs to change to develop a local fabrication supply chain in Scotland? Can we, and this has already been asked, and again I want to ask it, can we put a clause in contracts that carbon footprint has to be taken into account, i.e. carbon emissions caused by coming from far away? To Jim Smith, I see him on the screen first.
I think, look, I mean, I think there are still, as people have said, as Nick said right at the start, there are still opportunities going forward. This industry is only going to get larger. You know, not only is there the 40 gigawatt target by 2030 in the UK, but the EU last week I think came out with a 60 gigawatt target by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. So I think the scale of the opportunity is absolutely huge. I think the question is how do we attract that investment into manufacturing? And you know that's clearly the manufacturers, because it will require investment, and I think most of the manufacturers are looking for some form of government support to make that decision. There's no doubt that the market is here going forward. But the question is, where is the money for the manufacturing investment coming from? We as developers are not manufacturers. We're making significant investment in developing these projects, and ultimately when we hopefully then go through and build them. Taking your second point about carbon, again, I would just reiterate Matthew's point. We would welcome a scheme where carbon accounting of the construction of the project was taken into account. But again, with the proviso that it was across the UK to make sure we are competing on a level playing field.
Yes, you only need to drive all over Scotland and see the amount of wind farms that have developed over the last 5-10 years. So why are we not getting a fair share, or BiFab and other companies get steel facilities not getting a fair share of that work? Is it because you particularly are going elsewhere? You really need to tell.
We have tried, I think, more than most to try and support the Scottish supply chain. You mentioned BiFab. I mean, I think we invested £10 million in equity back in about 2011, which we effectively gave away for £1 when the company went into administration. We put a further £7 million into BiFab to stop it going into administration. We stepped in and saved the Winters factory back earlier in the decade from closure, and kept that going for a while until a manufacturer was able to come and buy it. Now, I know that has now run into difficulties. So I think, we have tried to make an impact in the Scottish supply chain, but it will be for manufacturers ultimately. And as I say, it does seem an overly simple message, but as long as we have to compete on price, we have no choice but to seek out the lowest cost supply. Otherwise, we don't have a project.
And can I ask Nick Sharp or Matthew Hugh their view? Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can speak to that. So I suppose I'd start here by saying that the majority of economic benefit from an offshore wind farm does not come from the fabrication of the steel that makes that wind turbine. And I'll come back to that when I discuss carbon in a second. But the majority of the economic benefit comes from the 20-25 year operations and maintenance phase of that wind farm. Now, we know that Scotland can compete there. We know that we can develop the skills that the rest of the world is going to need as it decarbonises its economy. SSE have created 100 jobs in Wick. It's not an area of the country where it's easy to get a job, and specifically to get a high-skilled, low-carbon job of the future, like one working in the operations and maintenance of an offshore wind farm. So we know the majority of the benefit comes at that point. And I think what the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership, the Offshore Wind Industry Council, the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council are considering is where we put our efforts here. And that's why a number of supply chain reviews are underway. The one I mentioned been headed by Sir Jim MacDonald and the Energy Minister earlier, to look at whether we support parts of the supply chain which can compete and support them to grow and to export their skills and to drive economic benefit, or whether we spend money supporting things like fabrication, where we know the majority of that work is now done abroad. And in fact, there is no, for instance, monopile manufacturing facility in the UK. We can't make monopile, so we'd have to start from scratch there. Do we want to spend the money on those businesses, or do we want to support the thriving supply chain businesses that are already winning contracts in offshore wind, not just in the UK, but in the rest of the world? That's a decision that we have to make, and we're currently, as I say, we're still at an early stage in the development of offshore wind in Scotland, and we're doing the studies at the moment to figure out where we should make those investments as an industry and as government public finance. In terms of carbon payback, I just wanted to reflect on something that I don't have the figure for offshore wind, but for onshore wind, the carbon payback of a wind farm is always less than 18 months. So we know that no matter how much carbon is generated during the production of steel and transport and the building of foundations and roads and setting up the site, we always pay that back in around 18 months or less, or considerably less. So the average age of a UK power station is more than 30 years. We have to replace our power infrastructure. We have to do it somehow. As Jim set out, there's always a carbon price to building something. You build a nuclear power station, you use a lot of carbon. So, building wind farms that pay back in 18 months or less is really the cheapest and smartest option here. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. EDF.
I think Jim and Nick provided some good element to the answer. I can only agree with what was said here. So I think there is a tremendous amount of opportunities going forward, and I think the collaboration that we put together, on the government side, setting the rules, with the supply chain, understanding where the opportunities are, and the developers, in articulating, what they see going forward in terms of technology development and overall cost. I think all of this will contribute to make Scotland benefit further from what is to come, and what is to come is a huge amount of opportunities. So there is certainly some learnings from what we've seen, focusing on trying to get manufacturers to win contracts, and I think we will not stop from trying that. But I think the price value we can get in working together and targeting the right area that will benefit the economy the most, I think it's definitively something that needs to be a big focus for all of us. And I think that's what we are trying to do with the various forums that are in place. So, I mean, reviewing the CFD rules, we're just going to say there is not a magic bullet, but there are a number of elements that we need to work on. The CFD rules is one of them, because I think this has been a challenge for all developers. Knowing that you need to be competitive and bid the lowest possible price has been something that has limited, how much we can do to support local supply chain.
Can I ask you, Matthew, EDF support of BIFAB, you said you were going to give them a contract for delivery of 8 jackets for your wider NNG project. Where are we with that?
So we worked very, very hard with Saipem or contractors for the jacket to get 8 jackets manufactured at BIFAB. That was a year ago when we agreed between Saipem. So Saipem agreed with BIFAB for the manufacturing of 8 jackets. Unfortunately, BIFAB has not been able to follow through and provide the guarantee it needs to get on and sign a contract. So once the contract should have been some time ago, it hasn't been the case. Now we're in a situation where the wind farm needs this jacket to be manufactured somewhere. And at the moment, the chances of this 8 jacket being manufactured at BIFAB are very, very slim indeed. Because we are just working out of, we're running out of time. And we've got commitments to our shareholders, to our other, to our supply chain and wider stakeholders to develop that wind farm. If we're unable to, if we don't have jacket, we don't have a project. So we're in an unfortunate position where, having worked extremely hard to make it possible, it's looking unlikely that BIFAB will manufacture this 8 jacket.
So another opportunity lost for Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
A brief supplementary from Graham Simpson before we come to questions from Gordon MacDonald.
Yeah, I just want to come back on that. Matthew, what is it that BIFAB need to do that they aren't doing in order to win that contract?
So when we had discussion with BIFAB and Saipem agreed to have a BIFAB manufacturing 8 jacket for the project, we had what we normally have in place, which is requirements for the contractor to provide some guarantees, so that we don't take an exposure unduly. Unfortunately, BIFAB has not been able to provide that guarantee, and so we have run out of time and are not able to follow through with BIFAB without such guarantees.
Sorry, what
we
guarantees?
Have to look elsewhere.
What guarantees do you need?
So that was a guarantee.
What guarantees?
We mentioned that would have been provided. It's for the work that is to be done for the 8 jacket. So if and without these guarantees, that means that we are taking the risks that shareholders of BIFAB should be taking, and no willing developers would be taking the risks that normally a company shareholder should take. So we are simply unable, given the risk profile related to BIFAB and the shareholders unable to cover for that risk, to go ahead with BIFAB at this time.
Sorry, are you saying that BIFAB couldn't guarantee to complete the work?
That's correct.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. We've touched much upon the CFD contracts, so I won't go over what we've already talked about. But what I wanted to ask you about was the 3 previous rounds that was under UK government ministers. As part of the bidding process, you have to provide supply chain plans. And the 3 criteria for that is competition, innovation and skills. There was no mention of carbon emissions. There was no mention of security of supply it all seemed to be a focus on affordable energy. And as we've heard this morning, the impact of lack of money in the system is that there is a lack or loss of skilled jobs in Scotland. So bearing in mind that the UK government has announced a consultation on supply chain plans, which closes on 18th of January, what has to change within supply chain plans to give Scotland a better chance of competing for some of this work? Nick.
Yeah, thank you. We, as part of our efforts as an industry body to help supply chain, we convened a supply chain forum not too long ago and took evidence, if you like, from our supply chain members. We've got around 45 supply chain members at Scottish Renewables, asked them what they needed in order to compete more effectively. And one of the things that was raised and which we've acted on was having a view of what was coming down the line. So being able to see what projects were likely to develop at various stages in the future and where they were in their development processes. The UK government already provides that information through something called the Renewable Energy Planning Database. And what we've been able to do at Scottish Renewables is analyse that data as it comes out quarterly and break it down for not just for our members, but for any company in the supply chain. This is something that we're providing beyond membership as a service to supply chain. Break it down and into onshore wind pipeline and offshore wind pipeline to let those companies see what is coming and to have more visibility of the pipeline that they need. So if they want to invest, they know that there'll be a market for their product down the line. And that's something that supply chain forum brought back to us as the most important thing we could do. And Contracts for Difference obviously has a competitive auction process. It's a closed process. We don't know who's bid into that process. Other developers don't know, and supply chain would just be speculating. So that really is quite a powerful way of giving people sight of the pipeline. But if anybody else wants to pick up on that beyond that.
Jim, I was wanting to ask you about a comment made by one of your colleagues, Alistair Philip Davis, in the Herald last week. And he was talking about contracts for difference. And he says, if people want different outcomes in terms of content, then people need to find ways of supporting businesses or insisting on certain content. Now, you've already touched upon we may need some kind of carbon pricing, but was there any other things that should be included? I know I'm asking you to read your colleague's mind, but presumably you've had discussions about this.
Yeah, no. I think point Alistair is making that if people are unhappy with the result of the process we have just now, if you don't change the process, you'll keep getting the same answer. So you need to change the process. As to what the solution is, that gets the balance between the lowest price for the consumer and getting more jobs in the country. It's clearly, if there was an easy solution, someone would have came up with it by now. I don't know whether it would be legal to put a mandatory target or not, to be honest. But if they did, then clearly developers would need to achieve that. Ultimately, I think some change needs to be made. I don't have an easy answer for it. I think we need, though, I think that the fact that the targets for building offshore wind are there in front of us, we know there's going to be a lot of offshore wind farms built. We need to get somehow confidence and investment in the supply chain across a number of different areas. I think it's wrong to just focus on one element of the supply chain. I can comment that we're working hard with a potential supplier on our Dogger Bank project to make an investment in Scotland, actually, for manufacturing. Now, I can't say much more about that, and it hasn't happened yet. It may not happen, but we're certainly working hard to. Many people have talked about this, but ultimately, unless the rules change, we will keep getting the same answer.
Yeah. Anybody else want to come in? Thank you.
Right, Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'd like just to ask the panellists what their view is on the new ScotWind leasing opportunities and specifically the supply chain development statements that apparently are required. In a letter that the Crown Estate Scotland wrote to the committee in July this year, they said that they had made the decision to require all applicants to ScotWind leasing to submit a supply chain development statement. However, in the letter that the Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop wrote to us in July this year, she said that whilst we cannot require or compel developers to provide a supply chain development as part of their ScotWind application, nor can we specify local content, etc. What is your understanding of the status of these supply chain development statements? Maybe start with Nick, you may have an industry overview.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, we have concerns about supply chain development statements, which we voiced at the summit with former Finance Secretary Mr. Mackay back in January, and I think I touched on them a little bit earlier, but I can go into that in a bit more detail now. You know, there's no doubt. I think hopefully from what you've heard, you understand that offshore wind developers are working very, very hard, and that's not. Sounds trite to say that, but it is not. And I know companies in the committee today have spent enormous amounts of time trying to make commitments to Scottish supply chain companies. Number of projects are currently underway to that end, as I discussed earlier. As an industry, we did feel that the addition of supply chain development statements to the ScotWind leasing process was unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. I talked earlier about the fact that it's very hard to make commitments at such an early stage in the process of developing a wind farm. Nart na Gaoithe and Moray East, for instance, both got leases in 2009-10 and will be commissioned in 2022. While we clearly need that process to speed up, it's very hard for project developers to commit to supply chain intentions at a very early stage in development. There is a risk, as I said, that these supply chain development statements are counterproductive, even on reputational damage alone, and that's taken outside the financial or termination of lease risk that hangs over supply chain development statements. Even on reputational damage alone, there's a risk that companies are tempted to lowbar their commitment, which is the opposite of what the policy is trying to achieve. We've suggested that because we recognise that early supply chain engagement is very important and can enable that clear investment pipeline for supply chain companies, we've suggested that developers set out a baseline commitment on supply chain, but also submit a high ambition set of figures, which would give some an indication of what was possible with a greater level of collaboration between supply chain, government, and industry. On the whole, you know, supply chain development statements, in whatever their guise at Scottish Government or UK Government level, are a way of bringing more clarity into a really complex process. It's just really important that that timing issue is considered. And also, as other witnesses have said, that we always think about whether we are making Scotland a less attractive place to invest. Because if we don't have companies who have the confidence to invest in Scotland, we don't have offshore wind farms at all, and therefore, yeah, we can't deliver those economic and environmental benefits. But we're working very closely with Crown Estate Scotland, and they've been very receptive in the process and have been very open to dialogue on this. So we hope that continues too.
If I could just follow up that answer, what's your understanding as to whether these will be required? Because the Scottish Government's saying they cannot require or compel developers to provide such a statement, and yet the Crown Estate Scotland have told us that it will be a requirement. What's your understanding?
That is going into a level of detail that I personally don't have experience of. It was my understanding personally that that was now part of the ScotWind leasing process. I can ask colleagues to to clarify, or indeed, I understand you're hearing from Crown Estate Scotland in a few weeks, so I'm sure they could do that then.
Yes, I mean, it's probably too early in the process, but obviously if your members have experience of this process or the early stages of this process, it'd be useful for the committee to have some evidence about how that's developing. Do any of the other witnesses have any comments on this area?
Specifically to do with floating, which of course is what the future is in Scotland. The biggest single challenge that we are addressing as a result of the experience that we've learned in Kingarden is that we chase the designers, because the designs that we've currently got for floating wind, most of them don't work very well in our ports because you need 13 meters and there's a limited number of ports with that facility. So what you can do is you can either go and fix the ports or you can fix the designs. And so obviously we're trying to work with designers to find designs which will work in shallower waters and be compatible with more of the facilities that we have on the east coast of Scotland.
Okay, thank you. If no one's got anything further to add, I'll...
So I think
Jim Smith?
Smith wanted to come in on that point.
Well, look, I'm not an expert on the details of the supply chain plans that are being talked about, but I think the point that perhaps the Minister was making, or the Cabinet Secretary, was that they can't mandate a percentage is manufactured in Scotland. But clearly the supply chain plan is for developers to set out what they intend to do. And I would just reinforce the point that Nick made, is that it's very difficult today to talk about what your supply chain plans will be when you build this thing, which based on could be 10 or more years later. Because the supply chain plan we'll be using in 10 years' time will probably look quite differently to the supply chain landscape today.
Thank you, Convener.
All right. If there are no further questions from committee members, I don't see any at the minute, so we'll thank our witness panel. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I will conclude this item on the agenda and we'll suspend the meeting at this stage. Thank you.